Today's the last of a series of 6 seminars which we've had on how the Christian faith has inspired people to work in their fields and empowerment of others. And the person who curated this was Jonathan Chaplin, who sends his apologies that he's away. He knew he'd be away in Germany at the moment. However, thanks very much to him for all the work that he's done to put these together. Now, as you know, the format for these series is the speaker will speak for about 30 minutes and then there'll be opportunity for questions, and this is an inclusive and a safe space, and afterwards there is coffee and some tea and biscuits and anything else that we possibly might have. And our thanks to Inclusive Church Group, who's behind putting this together. Now, our speaker is Cheney Paine, who will speak about empowerment through citizenship. She's a graduate of theology from our own New Hall, and interesting you call it New Hall College.
Shows you how old I am.
Well, I'll leave it at that. And she's taught in state secondary schools for a considerable period of time, which is for me probably about a couple of years, and is currently assistant principal at a secondary school in Cambridgeshire. Alongside this, she's a city councillor representing Castle Ward in Cambridge, and she's been on that since 2018. Outside school and politics, Cheney's a church organist, very impressive, playing occasionally at various churches in Cambridge. But one, I think, important detail, which she doesn't always tell people, is that she and her husband have 2 devoted cats, who sadly enough aren't here today, but I'm sure would feel the warmth of the citizenship.
They would have loved to come. But
So, Cheney, thanks very much.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for such a lovely introduction. Can you hear me all right? Perfect. I can just feel this thing on my ear, so I'm sorry if I keep fiddling about. I've got very small ears. Thank you so much for being here, particularly on such a lovely sunny evening where it must have been really quite painful to drag yourselves inside. But thank you for hosting us and for inviting me to speak in such a beautiful, lovely space as well. It sounds like you've had a fascinating series of talks. I just think it's so wonderful for people to bring and share their areas of expertise, but for people to be willing to engage with that as well. I think that's just wonderful. And tonight, I think when you presented this topic to me of faith and democracy or citizenship, it felt very timely, because I think we live in a time when politics feels kind of more urgent and more polarising than it probably ever has before. But I think really at the heart of politics, when it's at its very best, actually there's a conversation about values to be had. Politics is about people, what they believe in, what motivates them. And to get back to the true heart of politics, that for me is what we should be talking about. It's about what kind of society we want to build, how we live alongside one another, and even when we profoundly disagree, how we go about doing that well and respectfully. So I want to explore tonight the relationship that sits between faith and citizenship. I'd like to ask whether they're friends or foes, and whether faith is something that we should leave at the door when we enter political life, or whether it can be a source of wisdom, of purpose and integrity for us. So you gave me a lovely introduction, but yes, I'm Cheney. So I was born in Derbyshire. I moved to Cambridge in 2007, I think, which was to read theology. I was the last year group to graduate from Murray Edwards back when they were New Hall, which probably pinpoints me very clearly in time. And after being here for 3 years, I sort of decided that Cambridge had far fewer hills and a lot less rain than Derbyshire, and so I stayed. I spent a year doing special educational needs tuition around Cambridge, and then the year after that did my PGCE at Fitzwilliam College, so stayed around to teach. My first teaching role 15 years ago was in Bury St Edmunds at secondary school, and from that point on I decided that Cambridge was going to be my home. I've worked in 3 different schools over the last 15 years. As you said, I'm now an assistant principal at a school in St Neots, which actually has taught me a great deal about citizenship. It's one of the most deprived schools in Cambridgeshire, with the 5th highest in terms of students being eligible for pupil premium funding. So there is a very high level of need amongst our young people, and it's a really interesting challenge how we do that and what the purpose of citizenship and values education is in that kind of environment. I got involved in the Liberal Democrats back in 2016, not so much, embarrassingly, really, about their policies. I think I was a Lib Dem voter, but to me at the time, politics felt a bit like choosing your political party, felt a bit more like choosing which dress to wear for the day. I didn't have a particularly strong opinion about it, it just seemed to fit, and that therefore it worked. So for me, bizarrely, my way in was actually through a fabulous woman called Shahida Rahman, If you've done any work with the Eco Mosque on Mill Road, she was one of the initial founders and trustees of that project, and she works with the Karim Foundation, who work to deliver food parcels across the city, to do a huge round around tackling food poverty. And so she was standing to be the local councillor in my area, and she literally came and knocked on my door. And she was this incredible example of what quiet, determined service looks like. Part of me really liked the idea of helping get the first ever Bangladeshi woman Muslim elected to Cambridge City Council. That felt very, very inspiring. So I went out kind of door knocking with her, and then had this moment when I realised I'd sort of found my tribe in the Liberal Democrats. But aside from that, it really opened up my eyes to how those little things the council does that we almost don't notice, like emptying your bins, fixing your roads, mending that pothole on your roundabout, fixing the drains. Actually, they're the things that affect people's lives literally every day in quite a small way, but it sits on their minds. When I knock on people's doors, I do quite often, and ask what their number one priority is at the moment. Very few people say, oh, world peace, or a just transition to green energy, or all these things that politicians like to talk about. Instead, they say, well, actually, I'm really worried because I've got some black mold in the corner, and I'm disabled, so I can't get it down. Can you help me? I'm really concerned about paying my bills. I'm really worried about the holes or the drainage that's causing a flood. It's those little things, I think, that really rest on people's minds sort of day in, day out. And there's a real satisfaction, and what brought me into politics is the real satisfaction of going out there to solve them. So we still haven't got Shahida Rahman elected, though we are still trying. But she was a really big part for me in setting what my aspirations of politics is about. So I stood for election myself after, I say arm twisting is a very mild phrase. It was more like strapped behind me and I was marching the door. So I stood reluctantly in 2018 under a clear promise that I was very unlikely to win, but would I please try? And somehow I did win, which was bonkers. And so I was elected to represent Castle Ward, which is, I don't know if anyone lives there, but is sort of Magdalen Bridge upwards, going out, including Eddington and Darwin Green, so going out to Girton. I won very narrowly back in 2018 with just 25 votes, which was quite a nail-bounder, and a few recounts of that counts. And then I've re-stood there two times following that, with a slightly bigger majority each time, which has become more reassuring. A few years later on, so last year, I then had the privilege to be the general election candidate for Cambridge Lib Dems. So spoken a few hustings, chaired beautifully by people like Mia here. And that was such a huge privilege. We're now just beginning the process of reselecting our parliamentary candidate for the Lib Dems, ready for whenever the next general election might be. So I'm sort of just heading back out on the campaign trail for an internal election process at the moment. As you said, I also moonlight a little bit as a church organist in between St James's Church on Wolfston Way and then the Good Shepherd Church up in Arbury, which are both wonderful places and lovely communities that are such a real joy to be part of. I think in terms of my own faith, I realised when you asked me to speak that as an RE teacher I talk about faith quite a lot at school and religious education, and in politics I talk about politics quite a lot, so I've never actually talked about the two of them together, so this is it was an interesting experience. And I found it's not something I find easy, I think, to reconcile with sometimes. One of the things about a theology degree is it really focuses you to look very closely at the religious texts and really scrutinise them. And I remember my first year as a student at Newhall, sitting in my tiny pokey room, having this mind-blowing experience quite late at night when I was like, oh my goodness, the Old Testament didn't just drop out of the sky. It's actually written by scribes and people living lives over many, many years. It's been compiled and been put together. And that was just a fascinating moment. I'd never thought the Bible was absolute. I'm happy to put my cards on the table that I'm not a literalist Christian. But when you suddenly realise the level and the variation, the traditions that sit behind it, the wonderful stories of the scribes pootling about across the ancient Near East, writing their version of events. Oh, then underneath it, there's a tallies chart, which they think was how many sheep this scribe owned. Little things like that really bring it to life, and the kind of customs and traditions, the community, which sit behind it. So my faith doesn't always give me easy answers, but I try to use it as a way to help me ask better questions. And I think it's really important, particularly to step into politics, to remind that actually I'm not the centre of the universe. Very little about this universe is about me, or indeed about any of us. We are very small pinpoints in time. And I think remembering that fact is quite brutal, but it's actually quite important and quite grounding in terms of who we are. So for me, faith isn't about quoting scripture, it's not about enforcing obedience to a book, but I think it's something which offers quite a humility for that realisation, which is for me quite grounding. And I think it's important ultimately to listen to others when they tell me what matters to them as well, whether that's faith or politics or something else entirely. I don't think any belief system should have a monopoly on wisdom or goodness. And actually what makes citizenship quite so challenging and so interesting is the question of where does that truth come from? So for me, I'm a teacher and a politician, and I think there are a lot of similarities actually between those two roles, especially in the importance of your values. So I teach about faith and values as an RE teacher, but also from a whole school perspective. We also teach our young people how to face the world around them, and obviously we don't try to persuade them to a belief system, but we do teach about values. We teach about what respect means, about kindness, about tolerance. Our mantra is work hard, be kind, which we drum into them to try to instill those positive values. And one of the things I've noticed working in a much more challenging school, in an area of deprivation, is just how important that values education is. And when you're working with families who their conversation at the dinner table, if there is one, might be, what are we eating tomorrow? What are we eating tonight? The role of that values education, that wider world perspective, is something which just can be difficult to find from home. So I think education has a really important role there in shaping our young people's minds and their hearts as well. So as a politician, obviously, one of your roles is you stand up and you express your values. You seek to win others' support to them. And I think if you're a public advocate for something, you then really have an obligation to act on those beliefs in public life. What you do really, really matters. And in both roles, as a teacher and a politician, I think if you're professing your values, or even trying to persuade others towards them, then you really do have a strong moral responsibility to live them yourself. If I'd got myself a bit tipsy at Sunday lunch and set off down King's Parade in a shopping trolley, hurled out a bit of racial abuse and duffed somebody up, I can't begin to think, like, who would be more angry with me? Is it the leader of my school? Is it the leader of the Liberal Democrats? Is it God? Is it my mum? Is it the children who I've told how wrong that is? And suddenly, and you will find this in your own lives, when you put yourself forward as an advocate for something, those layers of responsibility weigh on you, along with your own values. Actually, what is the kind of person that I want to be? So thinking about faith and citizenship, I want to ask, there we go, a few things tonight. First of all, what do faith and citizenship have in common? And then where do they diverge? And also what happens when your personal belief and your public duty might come into conflict? So I'm obviously not standing here to promote any one faith or moral codes. I'll talk about my own faith and my own politics. I'm a Liberal Democrat, so that's where my knowledge obviously is the most strong. But I think the really interesting question, which I'm quite keen to hear your thoughts on too in the discussion afterwards tonight, is what role belief can and should play in public life, and what kind of leaders and citizens we might want to be. So for me, I think both faith and citizenship are about choices. All faiths ultimately have a set of religious doctrines, but then when those doctrines meet the real world, as a person of faith, you have to think about how to apply them well and make choices about what it means in reality. So faith for me is about more than rules and behaviours. It's our framework for moral understanding, and it gives you a sense of purpose. And I think for many people, the sense of belonging that you feel from being part of a faith community is hugely powerful. And I don't think, I talk to my friends who've stepped away from life within a faith community, and they say one of the things they miss. I think one of the few places you do find it, bizarrely, is in politics. I think I'm hugely lucky since joining the Liberal Democrats that I've suddenly become part of this multi-generational, diverse, multi-background, fascinating group of people, both amongst the party, but amongst my residents as well, who've become part of the day-to-day hum of my life, and I've become part of theirs. So the residents I represent, who I've come to know very well, there are people there I count amongst my absolutely dearest friends who I'm sure I would never have met, I just wouldn't have had the occasion to, if it hadn't been through politics. And I think there's something quite powerful about that shared sense of purpose when your morals align with the people around you on something that you feel really passionately about, that's integral to that, and it's something that you find as part of a faith community too. The idea of standing shoulder to shoulder, standing up for what you believe in is so powerful. Equally, our citizenship, it's more than just having our passport, it's more than about the laws that our country tells us to follow. It's being part of that civic project. We all have rights and responsibilities and the chance to shape the future that we share. So faith and democracy for me both offer identity. They shape the way in which we live, but they do it in very different ways. And interestingly, I always note that if we looked at some of the core teachings of many different faiths, you'd find the same values expressed in many faiths that political parties also do. We will all talk about care for the vulnerable, justice, respect for human dignity. I was thinking about compassion earlier and thought, well, if you take the quote, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, actually you see that there is very similar language used in the holy books from all of the main 6 religions. You then turn to the political party manifestos, and suddenly they're talking about the same things: treat others as you wish to be treated. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. We should give to others what we want done to us. So I think there is a huge amount of crossover in terms of some of those basic tenets of how we want society to function. And you can see that alignment sometimes of faith and politics in some quite interesting people. Oh, thank you. So it's someone like William Wilberforce. So William Wilberforce was a 19th century Conservative Member of Parliament, and he led the charge to abolish the slave trades. And that was absolutely not despite his evangelical Christian faith, but almost certainly because of it. And he believed, and he talked very proudly about how every human being was equal in God's eyes, and he applied that belief quite relentlessly in Parliament. And historians have described his faith as the engine behind his politics. You can see here, he talks about how, what is there in this life that should make any man contradict the dictates of his conscience, the principles of justice, the laws of religion and of God's. And that to me shows just how strongly his faith is guiding his politics. He spoke about how every person, no matter what their colour or status, was created equal in God's eyes. And that conviction gave him the moral courage to stand up almost alone at first, year after year, while the political and economic forces were still protecting slavery and saying, we can't change this, we can't undo this, we really depend on it. And he stood in the face of that. And that, for me, is some of the best of what faith can bring to public life. It can bring that fire for justice. It brings something that's grounded not in your ideology, but in your compassion and your conviction. I think another example, would you mind flicking me on? Thank you, would be Martin Luther King, who you will know, a political activist and, of course, a Baptist minister. And when he talks, I think his speeches are so interesting because they're rooted in the language, the music, the theology of his church in the American South. He wrote a letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, just after he was arrested for protesting against segregation. And he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And in his letter from the Birmingham jail, he addresses his fellow clergy who were writing to him to tell him to be more patient, more moderate, let the courts and the institutional handle things, leave to humans what is to humans and to God what is to God, all those good Christian things. And he pushed back against that because he believed what was happening was wrong. And I think you can almost hear his civic conscience speaking when he says one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. Now, I don't think Martin Luther King wanted a theocracy. I don't think he wanted a community where we all obey the laws of God and that is it. He's not trying to impose his faith on others. But what he's doing is he's using that kind of moral language of the faith tradition he's from to hold the democratic system to account, to say this is not good enough, to challenge it to live up to its own ideals of equality, liberty, and justice. And I think he understood there that democracy doesn't just run on procedure. There's lots of procedures about being a councillor and about politics and about democracy. There's lots of agendas and meetings and lists and actions. There's lots of things and boxes you have to tick. But to make the right decisions, the important bit that sits behind that is about your conscience. And sometimes you need to have people who are willing to say, well, this might be legal, but is it right? This may be popular, but is it just? And I think it is therefore possible to bring faith and morality, those principles of love your neighbour, to strengthen democracy. So for me, both citizenship and faith involve responsibility. We don't just have the rights to do things, we've also got that responsibility to act in a moral way. And in school, we try to instill in our students that duty to contribute to society. I encourage our young people to go out to do charity work. We go litter picking a few mornings a week. We sell poppies for remembrance, all those things that you'll be familiar with doing. And we do that to model and help teach those positive values. And you see other faith traditions have been doing that for millennium. So in Judaism, they have the concept of tikkun olam, which means to heal the world. And that's the idea that human beings have the responsibility to improve and try to fix as best they can the world around them. Islam has the pillar of zakah, so you pay 2.5% of your disposable income to charity. Sikhism has the value of seva, it's the idea of service or duty towards others. And you find that faith, I think it's quite amazing how faith often inspires people to give their time, their money, their energy to the common goods. If you don't mind flicking on to the next slide, thank you. We saw pictures like this, you might remember during COVID, when as times got more and more difficult, the Sikh Gurdwaras and Muslim charities across the UK just mobilised so quickly to feed thousands of people. And in doing that, they didn't ask, well, are you a Sikh? Are you coming to mosque tomorrow? They didn't ask who you voted for, what you believed in. They just did it because it's the right thing to do. And I believe that there are politicians out there who do this, who do that also, who do things because they're the right thing to do. We need more of them, but fundamentally that's the root of good politics. And I think as a local councillor, when you help someone find temporary accommodation, I sorted out a little disabled parking bay for one of my lovely old ladies last week, and I fundamentally believe that for most people, they don't do that because we hope for a vote back a bit later on in the year. We do it just because it's the right thing to do, and because we feel that sense of responsibility and civic duty in that role. So I think for me, one of the most interesting things about democracy, and where actually you start to see true courage in politicians, is when they make those choices that show their values, even when you know that half the population is going to disagree with them quite wholeheartedly, and they're willing to take that risk for the sake of their values. One of the things I'm most proud of as a local councillor was in 2021. So I led a petition with some of the Cambridge refugee support groups for the City Council to offer resettlement for refugees. It was just after the fire in the Moira camp. We didn't realise then how important this was going to be, because this was before Afghanistan fell. But actually that scheme now has opened up more broadly, and we're resettling and offering sanctuary to about 300 refugee families across Cambridgeshire and South Cambridgeshire, which I'm so proud of and is amazing. And for me, that was without question the right thing to do, and I think for many politicians it would be exactly the same. Reassuringly, it was the right thing to do for Cambridge as well. So we were in the middle of lockdown, in the time when none of us were going anywhere, apart from our hours allowed walk every day, remember those days? But we still raised 2,000 signatures online, just through reaching out to friends, family, colleagues. It had to be a purely online-based campaign, which we thought was going to be very difficult. But actually people were hugely interested and hugely supportive. But we did also a little bit of a social media campaign around it, a few videos, some posts on social media, and the abuse coming back was just horrific, absolutely awful, to the point where we just started hiding the comments in the end because it was too much to read. But I reflected afterwards that during that, at no point did we think, oh gosh, have we got this wrong? So many angry people on the internet disagree, so maybe I'm wrong. We didn't change our minds. We kept going because it was the right thing to do. And that is on such a tiny scale an example of how that courage, that sense of values and beliefs can lead you through. It was Cambridge Pride yesterday, and I was thinking about Lynn Featherstone, who is a Lib Dem MP, what she would have faced when she first argued that same-sex marriage was right and just. And she wrote quite recently about examples like this that she had happen to her, and the death threats that she received. This was when she was sitting in a meeting with faith groups, and that first line there was said by an evangelical Christian. I think most of us would find it quite shocking, and to receive that, to hear that, for anyone, whatever your political colour, must be incredibly, incredibly hard. I think lots of politicians have a really bad reputation. I hear from lots of people, oh, you're all the same, I'm not voting, no one's listening to me. And sometimes that's quite right and quite fair. But actually there are examples of people who use that position of power as a way to live out their values, with or without faith. I think it's tremendously courageous to do so. So there are some similarities then. Both faith and citizenship give us this moral compass. They create strong communities and they inspire action. But I think there are tensions between the two as well. And I think there's a challenge for both religion and democracy of where we believe truth or where we believe legitimacy comes from, and who has the right to make those rules. So in a democracy, authority flows from the people, and the people make those decisions. They vote through elections, through debate, and we govern in our society through public consent. The public have to agree before something can happen or before a law can change. And if public opinion changes, the law will also change, as it did in the case of same-sex marriage. In many faith traditions, I think that's a bit more of a tricky question. Where does authority, where does right come from? Because it comes from God, or it comes from a sacred text. And that is often seen to be unchanging. So I think, and I've experienced this myself, where a real challenge can be for a person of faith is when society and its laws and views have changed around us. And for the last 2,000 years, they really have changed quite a lot. But then you find your religious teachings might not agree with the democratic law or with the public consensus. And there you're in a position where you have to decide what guides your actions. Is it the public will? Is it your own conscience? Is it your holy book? And what happens when those things are saying different things to you as an individual? The abortion referendum in Ireland in 2018, I thought was quite an interesting example of this. So as you can see, 66.4%, so a clear majority of people voted in favour of this. But in Ireland, the Catholic Church opposed it. So the democratic right of people can decide the law, But then the church would argue, and those people who voted against would argue, that, well, actually that vote doesn't change something. Surely something can't be morally right if God forbids it. The blasphemy laws in Pakistan are another example of this. That's seen as a divine law, but can conflict with the democratic principle of the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. So there's that tension between the democratic right to decide law as a citizen and your position of faith, if you believe that what God decides is ultimately right. And so if we don't agree where authority comes from, it's difficult to govern. And so something that I think is quite interesting is how, as a person of faith, how do you participate in a system where you have to have compromises, you have to have debate, and where change happens, people's views change. And I don't think that means that faith is bad for democracy, but I think people of faith who believe in an absolute divine law have something really difficult and challenging asked of them to bring their deepest convictions into public life with the humility and the openness that you need, and with ultimately a willingness to coexist with people who see the world very differently to them. I think it's really healthy for democracy to include everyone, people of all faiths, people of none. And that means that those public arguments and policies must be justified in terms that all citizens can understand. There was a philosopher, John Rawls, who referred to this as the public reason, which is the idea that we can bring our own values to politics, but we have to express them in a shared language. We have to talk about things in a way that others understand. And so if I were to say, I think we should change this policy because my religion says so, well, that might mean a huge amount to me, but it's not going to persuade anyone else who doesn't share my faith, and nor should it, because I'm not speaking in terms that they can understand. I think there are also some quite hard personal dilemmas when your own beliefs, which you will hold deeply, might clash with the role that you're elected to perform. I was thinking again about the same-sex marriage debates, and there are a number of MPs and peers, including Lib Dem MP Tim Farron, who really struggled and talked openly about their struggles about how to vote due to their religious conviction. And some felt that they had to choose between faith and equality. Baroness Sudha Warsi is a Muslim Conservative peer, and she resigned from the government a couple of years ago over the UK foreign policy in Gaza, which is hugely brave. And she later said, there comes a time when you have to ask yourself what you believe in and whether you're prepared to act on it. So I think faith does belong in politics, and I think it has to, because politics is about people, and we're all driven by our beliefs and values, and we can't take those out and separate them from who we are. And I think for me, wisdom and good governance comes from recognizing what those values are and where they come from. So when you use them, you come to it from a conscious position of understanding how you're feeling and what's guiding your actions. Faith, I think, gives people this real sense of justice, and it gives them courage. It propels them to speak out when others might stay silent on difficult things. It gives you humility. It gives you a sense of service. One of the difficult things about politics is that politicians often think in terms of the short term, how will people feel about this come the next election? What's the next ballot box going to say? But faith gives you a long-term view, which takes you far, far beyond that. But there's also risks, and I think when faith becomes fused with state power, when one religious group is able to dominate policy, then democracy is fundamentally weakened, and we only need to look at parts of the world where religion is used to justify oppression or exclusion to see the dangers of that. We've had our own debates here in the UK, such as when Rowan Williams, back when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, he suggested there could be space for limited Sharia law in civil matters like marriage. And he wasn't asking for the religious courts to overrule national law, but the backlash was absolutely huge, and it brought out questions around how we respect and celebrate religious identity, whilst also ensuring equal treatment for everyone under the law. So I'm a Liberal Democrat, and I believe in the freedom of belief, freedom of speech, freedom from persecution. And for me, the preamble to our Constitution, after Shahida Rahman, is the reason that I'm a Liberal Democrat. And it says the Liberal Democrats exist to build and safeguard a fair, free and open society where no one is enslaved to ignorance, poverty or conformity. I suspect you could put the manifestos or the preambles, the constitutions from most political parties up in this room, and they would say something similar. I don't think you would find much difference between what a Labour politician wants, what a Green politician wants, what a Conservative politician wants, because fundamentally, most people want equality, we want inclusion, we want the rule of law. I think as a person of faith, I often think I'm fortunate to sit in a position where those values rarely come into conflict because I've reconciled for myself where my faith is. But that doesn't mean they won't be in future, and that sometimes we have to admit that we're wrong. I think the role of conscience here is also hugely powerful. So this is Paddy Ashdown, who was the leader of the Lib Dems from 1998 to 1999, but then became the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina in 2002, where he did hugely important diplomatic work. And he was openly a Christian. And he once said, politics is not just about power, it's about purpose. Without values, politics is just a game. And I think that's so true. I have met people in politics who, when you ask them, oh, what brought you into politics? It's all about them. It's about the power. It's because there's something that they want to achieve as their own pet project. It's about the belief that they're right and they've got an agenda that they want to promote. And for them, it is this game to see how many people you can persuade. And I get it. I see that winning those arguments, whipping up public opinion around you, must be incredibly intoxicating. If we take a look at this man, which said rather not, if we look at Nigel Farage, I could not disagree with this man more resoundingly if I tried, but we can't deny he's captured the public opinion, and actually people have a democratic right to express that. But what I would ask is, what is his purpose? When all the hype and all this stop the boats nastiness dies down, what's he trying to achieve and what will come next? He has the power, but what's he going to do with it? And I think purpose and power are very different things. So for me, democracy doesn't ask people to leave their faith behind at the door. It asks us to bring our beliefs out into the public sphere, but bring with it respect, humility, and a real willingness to listen to other people. And it's not about privileging one worldview, either religious or secular, but about creating this shared space where we can all belong. And honestly, for me, and this is probably the best part about my day job, if you want hope for the future, I would just go and sit in a classroom. I've had students and heard lessons where they've asked such amazing questions about fairness and justice that would put the people on the green benches in Parliament utterly to shame. And they can talk about race, about gender, about climate, about identity, not with hostility, but with a genuine interest to understand. So I think when we teach them to think critically, to value difference, to stand up for the vulnerable, for me, that's what civic education should look like. And that's a part of democracy in action. And that really does give me hope that the next generation might do a better job of living out the values that we talk so much about. So on the campaign trail, I've met people of every faith, I've met people of none, I've met many people who are drawn to public service because they want to live out their values, be that fairness, compassion, justice or truth. And those values aren't owned by any one religion or any one worldview, but sometimes it's a person's faith that brings them to life. So in terms of where that leads us, I think for me, faith and citizenship are not the same thing, but they speak to the same kind of needs. We all have a need for purpose. We all want to belong. We all want justice and fairness. We all want to feel that our lives contribute to something much bigger than ourselves. So they speak to that same kind of quite primal need in us to be seen and to be recognised. And at their best, I think they both call us to look beyond ourselves, to look for the dignity in others, to shoulder our responsibilities, to build something better than what we've inherited. And they challenge us as well, not to retreat into comfort or cynicism, but to stay engaged, even when that's difficult, even when we lose. As a Liberal Democrat, I've got very used to losing over the last few years, and even when the world seems really indifferent to the things that you're trying to say. And I believe for me that's where faith and citizenship meet. They meet in that persistent, hopeful work of building your community, of speaking truth, of acting with integrity. And of course there will be tensions. There will be moments for all of us where we feel torn between conviction and compromise, between tradition and change. But actually I think those moments don't need to weaken us. We should see them as moments forcing us to think harder, to listen better, to lead more thoughtfully. So I think faith shouldn't dominate politics, but nor should it be driven out. It needs to take its place equally alongside other voices, where it needs to be listened to, it needs to be open to challenge, and it needs to be welcomed. Not because it has all the answers, but because it brings a moral language, it brings a call to conscience, and a reminder that politics is about people, not policy, and definitely not power. So as a teacher, a counsellor, a person of faith, I don't want to live in a world where we all agree. I want to live in a society where we can disagree well and where conscience isn't silenced, but it's expressed with care and respect to move us forwards. And I think even the hardest of debates, we should never forget that every single person, every neighbour, is also a human being, bringing their own values, which they hold, and they have a right to hold them. So I began by asking whether faith and democracy are friends or foes. I think for me, they can be, and often are, friends, but only if we approach them with humility and if we use those values to serve others, not to silence them. If we ask not just what do I believe, but how can I live that out with integrity in the society I live in. So we need leaders of conscience, we need citizens who care, and we need a public life to be a place where different convictions are not a threat, but are a strength. So I came to sort of 3 questions at the end of this talk, which I thought I'd pose, but I'm sure you have your own questions as well, which is, can faith-based ethics enrich public life without dominating it? And how do we find that line between enriching and dominating? How do we hold the space for different beliefs while building a shared future? And then what values should drive our politics forward? What do we want to see in the world? So I have a fundamental hope that we can build a democracy where our consciences are welcomed, not feared, and where our differences help us to build things, not break them. Thank you. I'll hand over to you for questions.
Thank you. That was an absolute tour de force, and fantastic and engaging and wonderful. Thank you. Now I'm going to open up for questions. You can either deal with those questions or ask your own. Can I just ask that you introduce yourselves? I realise I didn't introduce myself. I'm Rob McCorquodale. I'm the Vice Chair of the PCC, which is the trustees of this church. Also, relevantly, I'm an international human rights lawyer.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob. Thank you. That was a great talk. I'm Mia Gray from St. Paul's, but I'm also a professor of geography, economic geography at the university, at Cambridge University. I wondered if you could talk about how transparent you think faith should be in public life for a politician. That really interests me because, you know, so much of what you said is I just completely agree with, and how, you know, the having a moral compass and not having a kind of approach to politics that is about the self and just about kind of the game of politics, which I see sometimes, you know, with my students at Cambridge. You know, they're into kind of student politics, but it really is about the game often. But also, you know, they do sometimes have, you know, passionately held beliefs. But do you think we should be very transparent and say, well, not only that I am driven by values, but this is where my values come from, and is this something that you do yourself, or how do you negotiate that?
I think it's such a good question, and I think politicians can sometimes, you can feel like you'll bring a lot of scrutiny on yourself if you start talking about where your beliefs and your values come from. But I think with questions like that, I tend to think of, if I was going at it from any other perspective, would I talk about what my values are, why I think what I do? And I think the answer would be yes. And therefore, I think for me, it should be the same if that value is faith-based. So when I try to think about some of the very difficult issues that we face in the media and in kind of national politics, there's a lot at the moment around inclusivity. Our friend Nigel Farage, who we had to see earlier, sorry about him, and here's the campaign that he's developing around that, which to me is just hideous. And when thinking about those things, I think, well, do we just try to avoid it, or try to brush it under the surface and hope it kind of all dies down and goes away, which maybe it will? Or do we go out there and do we challenge it? And do we say, actually, no, I don't believe that. That's hideous. I believe in this. I believe in the fundamental dignity of human beings. And then I think, well, I have to explain why. Why do I believe that in the face of people who might think very differently? And I think actually we should be prepared to always explain why we think what we do. As a teacher, we do it as well. We explain, we're learning this today because I want you to do this because. And if we can't justify where that comes from, then I think we sort of need to go back to look at what our first beliefs are. So if our faith leads us to believe or say or think something that we think actually isn't quite right, or that we feel ashamed to talk about, we probably need to go back to look at where that comes from. So I think yes. I think there should always be other things that guide your thinking as well. So it should never be like just talking about your faith. I'm sure when politicians speak in Parliament, they're also informed by research, by development, by talking to their residents and their constituents. But I think that your faith can have a bearing alongside and equally to those other things, absolutely.
Thank you. And it's a follow-on from the transparency question in one way. My name is Alistair Mack. I attend this church, and I spoke here 2 or 3 weeks ago on education. Has there ever been a tension between a political decision about short-term benefits and maybe a faith-held position which has a longer term perspective? Has there been an issue where you've had a tension between a short-term requirement, maybe to meet electoral boundaries or expectations within your party or some constraint, and longer term and perhaps faith-based requirements?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm worried this is the kind of question where I'll be in the shower tomorrow morning and suddenly think, oh yes, there is. But thinking about this for me now, and this might be because I'm a local councillor, so the level of politics with which I'm engaged is obviously much, much smaller than it would be as an MP. The kind of decisions I make are much, much smaller. I haven't experienced that at all. I've felt situations where I've been conflicted in terms of what's right, in terms of values. So sometimes you'll have moments where one group of residents wants one thing very passionately and another wants another thing. And you kind of have to think, well, which of you actually has more worth, who needs this the most? That might be the community who is more deprived, that might be the community who's had other issues in the past, and you have to find those compromises. So sometimes I feel it's almost making a bit of a value judgment about if there's two things I can do, which of them should I do? And I know it's going to really annoy half the people talking about this, and often that is the situation. Every local referendum you do is always 50-50. So for me, not with my faith, but in terms of how I judge those people, I think. But I can imagine that if you are in a position where you're talking about really big national issues like the abortion laws, like same-sex marriage, I think the trans and gender identity question at the moment is really conflicting for a lot of members of Parliament. I'm not in a position where anything I kind of look after influences those those huge critical issues, but I'm sure on a more national level it is. But for me, not personally.
Hi, my name's Patrick Morris. I come to church here, and I'm interested in Nigel Farage. I'm definitely not a supporter, quite the opposite, but I'm interested in his appeal and what you think his appeal is, because and a lot of people particularly on the populist right, I think of that. Perhaps it's this sense of emotional freedom with which they, and particularly he, speaks in public, which we don't see in a lot of national politicians. But I wonder what you think actually is his appeal to people on that deeper level, because it sometimes seems to be that he puts whatever values he has very straightforwardly. Anyway, what are your thoughts about that?
I think you're totally right. I think he does. I think you asked before about do we explain where our values come from. I think he does that in a way that kind of taps into some deep-rooted fears he feels that people have. But I think ultimately, one of the strongest emotions people feel is resentment. And he absolutely brings out that politics of resentment. If things are not going well for me, it's much easier for me to find someone to blame than it is to look to myself. And Nigel Farage will stand there and say, yes, your life's not going very well. You don't have as much money as you would like. Yes, it's all very terrible. But it's all the brown people over there. It's their faults. And he creates this scapegoat for people in such an insidious, I think, hideous way that it gives people a sense of the other. And that sense of there is an other which we don't like is really, really powerful. We talked about Martin Luther King earlier and the debates around race and segregation. I think that very much plays into that kind of sense of resentment and rejection. And I think he manages to present views which, I feel like most people should find quite shocking in a way that, as you say, is quite relatable. He expresses it in very human terms. People say, oh, you could go down the pub with him and have a beer, as if that somehow makes him a good politician. But I think coming across in that way that sets him apart as others, presenting himself as someone who is very kind of affable and likeable, and actually I'm saying the things that you really want to say but no one else is allowed to. People find that quite empowering. And then we talk about the Overton window sometimes in politics, so sort of the window of what is acceptable to talk about and what isn't. And he has stretched it very, very far to the right. So suddenly other things that people once upon a time didn't think were acceptable to talk about now feel that they can. And so he's kind of unlocked that in people. And where it comes from is this sense of rejection, resentment. Their lives are not what they should be. And there are many layers of government failings. I think all politicians have to answer to that. There are many layers of government failings that lead to the divide we have in terms of equality and wealth and opportunities. We need to solve that, but he finds a way for people to kind of bring it out and focus it onto somebody else in a way that's really, really difficult. I think we're very lucky in Cambridge that we don't find many Reform voters, but they do exist, and they have a right to be heard in that. But I think the important part that we should hear from it is actually what is the dissatisfaction they have with life, what are the struggles they're facing. And if you can start to solve those, then people don't need to resort to the sort of scapegoating and rejection that he has. I think we probably saw the same in the Brexit referendum as well, that we look for a policy of rejection and resentment to say to people, well, if we can get rid of this thing, it will all be better. It wasn't, but in the moment, that short-termism, people don't see that.
I have two questions. Sorry, I'll ask one now and then come across to you. Firstly, congratulations on your courage of coming out and saying that you have faith, because particularly those of what I would call liberal Christian faith, very rarely do they say this. Does it take courage to be public about your faith? And related to that, you talk about public life. Should people, say, who are CEOs of companies also be open about their faith, because they're also in public life?
Yeah, I'd never actually done it before today, I don't think. I talked to friends about my faith, obviously quite a lot, and part of being a theology student is you sit and ramble about your faith in the buttery, don't you, quite regularly after lectures. But I haven't spoken about my faith in public before, and so I thought I think we were in email contact at the time, and I said, oh, this is quite different, isn't it? And I thought, well, what will this be like to start to try and unpick it? It's actually been quite cathartic, I think, so thank you for that experience of trying to put things into words and explain them. I think it's quite a good exercise, as I think when you try to start explaining something, and faith is so complex, isn't it, and so personal. Whenever you try to explain something that is that difficult, it brings some clarity to your own thinking, so that's been a really good process for me. I do talk to other Liberal Democrats about the party, about religion and about faith. We have really good debates, and I really, really welcome those and welcome that challenge. Most of my own family are atheist, and we have those kind of dinner table debates around it, and I really enjoy those as well. So I think it's important that we put faith there as something that can be challenged, and it shouldn't be sort of hidden away from challenge and dispute because it's faith, because it's personal. Just like I would challenge someone's views that I disagreed with, just like we'd challenge Nigel Farage if he walked in the door. I hope I kind of put my faith there in line for that as well, much as that can be a difficult process. I think it's important we take on that sort of same scrutiny, and that's when you start to see actually what you really do believe, when you kind of pick through those different layers.
That's brilliant. My second question was about business, whether they should do it. And the reason I asked that is I ran an organisation, and after a couple of years I decided to put a cross on my wall, just because I felt I didn't do it publicly at all. And what was interesting for me was see how people responded to that, which was fortuitously none were surprised, but it then became a topic of conversation which it hadn't been before. So similarly, those running companies or other public engagement, how open do you think they should be?
I'd be interested to know, how did your colleagues react to you when they did begin to talk about it?
Out of interest, really, not at all critically. I think some found it awkward because they particularly had a colleague who was Jewish who found that a little bit confronting. And it was put behind the door, so it was only when the door was closed you saw it, but if I was in a meeting that would be appropriate. So and actually the way it came out most powerfully is my twin sister died, and a number of them wrote and said, "You're in my prayers," who'd have never said that in any other context. So it was actually quite a sort of a powerful experience.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I think it shows how it can give people confidence as well if you're willing to share your own faith. Others who might feel they shouldn't be sharing it in the kind of the place of work or in a big business suddenly feel empowered to do so, which is wonderful. I think for me, I would agree with you that it's what you feel comfortable with doing. If you would like to, if that's part of you that you would like to share, I have colleagues who share photos on their walls of people in their family, or of little phrases or mantras that might be important to them, because that's for them, seeing that each day, that's motivating, that's empowering, it's something that's helpful to kind of their day-to-day living. And I think if for you, your faith does that for you, then you should absolutely have a right to do it. And it's interesting how it brings out those same kind of emotions in others. Maybe it's quite liberating for people to create a kind of community as well, a kind of environment where you can talk about those things equally. Just as you would talk about what do you do at the weekend, surely it's okay to also talk about your faith and be honest about that. And I think that kind of environment where that's not toxic, that's not hidden, that's not something that's frightening, is such a good thing to create. So I think that was a really good thing to do.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, my name is Philippa, and I suppose in the interest of transparency, I should say I'm an ex-Christian. There's a fortnight's discussion of that, or there's nothing, I'll leave it at that. But I'm well educated and understand the vocabulary of Christianity. And I have a massive, massive interest in faith and what makes people do what they do. I'm a humanist myself. But when you're just the phrase faith-based ethics means nothing to me. Definitely, it doesn't necessarily explain anything about a person who says their ethics are faith-based. I mean, you can think of a massive range of opinion within Christianity, within Judaism. I don't know much about Islam, but from seeing the people like Shahida we know, or others seem to be very negative about other things that she's positive about, you think, well, where does that come from? So I think it's really not going to get you very far if you say, even just putting a cross on the wall. Putting a cross rather than a crucifix, maybe, a different shaped cross, would tell some people some things, and it would frighten the bejesus, as they say, out of others. And then you've got trauma-based awareness, and you have to think very carefully before putting any sort of symbols up. That's because people's personal experience of their faith and the faith of other people has to be explained if it's going to be used in a discussion. So it's no good saying, well, I'm a Christian and I'm going to debate with that in mind. Fine, say that and be transparent. But then you've really got to go a bit further and say, and I do this sort of Bible study and I do that sort of prayer. Think what a difference the Methodists made to the Church of England. I mean, the things you were saying would have horrified the people who built this.
Yes.
I was just thinking, listening to you talking, and you and I have very little not in common. And think of the people who put this lot up, and the things they would have assumed about the role of women, and the hierarchy, and the rightness of the poor man at the gate and the rich man in his castle. The words of all things bright and beautiful. I mean, can you really sing the fifth verse?
Oh, people
I'm just saying that you need to explain in much more detail, and people don't really have time. Sorry, I've gone on a bit, but because it is so complicated.
It is, and does it... And
you've really got to explain what sort of Liberal Democrat you are sometimes.
Yeah,
and that's a bit quicker because we know a bit more, and it's a bit of a shallower range. But what is faith-based ethics, really? Supernatural or natural? How much does judgment come into it? Is it pie in the sky?
Yeah.
Can you justify the Spanish Inquisition? Yeah.
And where does anyone's ethics come from, I suppose? People are fundamentally complex, aren't we? And you could ask anyone about your ethics, faith-based. They've all been formed by all of our experiences over so long. And so when we talk about things being right or good or moral, or that might actually mean something slightly different to different people. And it just shows how society changes so much, which for me is why I think it is important to have those conversations, to talk about those things, because that might shape and change your view. But yes, you're right, society is fundamentally complex and people are very, very complicated people. But I think if we can allow that space where actually your ethics might be different to mine, they're probably not, Philippa, if we're honest on many things, but we often align. But there may be people who have very different views, but actually they're equally as worthy to be part of that discussion, even though we disagree with them. It comes back to that sense of disagreeing well, I think, which is important for me.
I'm Andy Gordon. I'm on the PCC here at St Paul's. Cheney, thanks for a fantastic talk. I wanted to pick up on what you'd said at the start and what you just said again about disagreeing well. And just topically, I'm sure we were all absolutely shocked to hear this news about these 2 politicians shot dead in the USA yesterday, which brings to mind violence against politicians in this country. And Joe Cox, I guess that was during the Brexit referendum. And I just wonder, what is your take on that particular issue? I mean, obviously we're not the same as the USA, but still there has been violence in our politics here.
There has, yeah.
And I wonder your perspective.
I think it's so frightening. Obviously we had the Joe Cox, and then there was another Conservative politician David Amess, thank you. Yeah, more recently, he was leaving his constituency office. And it's just horrific. And I can't imagine what it must be to be so in the public eye and know that that's happening to your colleagues, to people you've sat with and you've worked with. Like, that must be absolutely terrifying, that just because of something that you represent or something you stand for, you're suddenly subject to violence. I think Donald Trump, I didn't put a picture of him here tonight, as I thought that was a step too far for all of us on a Sunday night, but even after Nigel Farage, but he has created this real sense of anger. And again, it's that resentment, it's that sense of othering. This is somebody else's faults. And it's so sad over the last sort of 10, 15 years, how that violence and that anger seems to find a place where it's being legitimised. And I think that's really, really hard to unpick, as also once something's happened once something's been said once the Overton window has moved, does it legitimise it elsewhere for others as well? So no, my heart really goes out to people in America for a number of reasons at the moment, but I think we have to be very aware that we're also not immune to it. And there's only small things we can do as individuals, but setting that tone of respect and challenging, like the angry language, the aggression, when we hear it day to day, is kind of part of how we can have our own little private battles to help with that. But I think society is very disillusioned and disenfranchised in many ways, which is really sad.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached our time. You've just been so engaging and interactive and just enlivened the topic enormously.
Thank you for such a lovely audience.
And as I said earlier, thank you for your courage in doing this. Not easy. And so just to say afterwards, there's tea and coffee and drinks if you want, but I think if we could all just thank Cheney so much for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.